Sacramento Art Revolution. So for those of you that don't know, I'm Vago, aka James. I'm a regular at City Council.
Yeah.
And I'm constantly trying to fight for repeal of the anti-camping ordinance and actual solutions. Things that will actually improve the lives of people on the streets rather than sending police after them to cost our taxpayers a bunch of extra money without solving anything. So I'm going to start off by going ahead and handing it over to your Sacramento Art Revolution.
Hello everybody, welcome. We're your Sacramento Arts and Revolution.
Something's wrong with the mic.
We're a local Sacramento-based street theater arts and revolution group, and what we mean by that is we use street theater and what we're learning, taking techniques from something called theater of the oppressed, is where the people that are oppressed play parts of their oppressors. One of the things that I got out of this is in some of these skits I play a very abusive cop. That's been very cathartic for me. It's been very therapeutic. A lot of us get different things out of this. One of the things that I get is self-development, and it helps in my public speaking and how I handle myself in day-to-day events. I am homeless. I've been living approximately 13 years on the streets of Sacramento. Prior to that, I owned a home on 28th Street. My last career, I worked for Campbell Soup for 20 years. I did not have any kind of a criminal record before I came homeless, and the only reason that I have anything on my record now is due to the oppression caused by our city government. I've had my vehicle towed. I've been arrested for things like jaywalking, harassed, been told in the city that I owned a home, I was told I can't use public bathrooms. So some of us feel really strongly about this, so we meet every Tuesday to practice your Sacramento Arts and Revolution, and everybody's welcome. We have everything from a gardening program to free sewing classes to, of course, our street theater work. And now I'm going to sit every Sunday at 1 o'clock, and that's at 1715 I Street at Hacker Lab, every Sunday at 1 o'clock, your Sacramento Arts and Revolution. Now we're going to read some statements. The city government's ongoing housing policy perpetuates and devastatingly intensifies systemic racism and structural racism. We've come here before to discuss how it is that elected public policy leaders like yourself, with apparently no conscious agendas of racism or white supremacy. Now I'm speaking to Mr. Mayor, Miss Ashby, Mr. Carr, Mr. Hanson, Mr. Chenier right there. They're sitting right there. That's how much they cared to come out and talk to us. The mayor did send his chief of staff, so thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Jacob.
That's a title and it's a note taker.
Yeah.
We all need to know that.
Today we would like to illustrate in more specific detail of the historic processes and ongoing effects of current policy which produce our present practical and moral crisis. What is systemic racism? It is a system in which public policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, perceptions and practices, and other norms work in various, often reinforcing ways to perpetuate racial group inequity. It identifies dimensions of our history and culture that have allowed privileges associated with whiteness and disadvantages associated with color to endure and adapt over time. Systemic racism is not something that a few people or institutions choose to practice. Instead, it has been a feature of the social, economic, and political system in which we all exist. The term structural racism is often used interchangeably with systemic racism and is most often practically synonymous. If there is a difference between the terms, it can be said to exist in the fact that structural racism, as analytical term, pays more attention to the historical, cultural, and social psychological aspects of our currently racialized society. The difference in income between Ed Harris from your Sacramento Arts and Revolution.
Again, the routine is we have our city council here to address them. We're here. Systemic racism or structural racism are rooted deeply in the historic reality of our society. This means that archaic institutions like bond servitude, slavery, the predatory sharecropper system, and Jim Crow laws
It's right there, it doesn't matter.
resisted the force of legal abolition and adapted and morphed into the new institutions, or most insidiously into successive practices and psychological perspectives and habits of thought which assume the power and substance of formal institutions. Here in Sacramento, in terms of the modern history of our housing market, the city was shaped by racial segregation through the legal institution of racially restricted covenants. Legal documents that enforce racial discrimination in housing and restrict the people of color to racially segregated, material marginalized, and under-resourced, critically underserved neighborhoods, mostly concentrated in what was referred to in Sacramento as the West End. We might point to a number of policies and practices which resources were restricted in neighborhoods like those of the West End were marginalized. Most important, the notorious practice of redlining. The specific practice called redlining began with the National Housing Act of 1934, which established the Federal Housing Administration. Redlining soon became an almost inevitable adopted practice by white-owned banks, home lending institutions, and government housing programs. Stated simply, redlining is a practice of denying services either directly or through selective rising prices to residents of certain areas based on the racial or ethnic composition of those areas. Perhaps the most critical example of redlining have involved denial of home and mortgage lending, but also included other financial services such as banking or insurance, or then other services such as healthcare. Even supermarkets have been denied to residents of redline communities. Thank you.
With racially destructive covenants and redlining, the residents of segregated neighborhoods hoping to buy homes had to buy into predatory contract agreements. High cost, high interest, with arbitrary added cost. And if the non-white homeowner could not keep up with the payments, they lost everything they had invested. They had no equity. So contract agreements were really designed so that home buyers would fail and the seller lenders would keep the money and sell and lend on the same property over and over again. In this way, the community in general was plundered and deteriorated, and the property there lost value. Our schools and other vital social services, but most particularly our schools, are funded by local property taxes. Where the property values are low, schools and local community services are underfunded. In the 1950s, the city government and influential business interests targeted the West End for urban renewal. The Federal Housing Act in 1949 was supposed to provide federal money to provide quality low-income housing. Initially, the Sacramento Planning Office announced its urban renewal program would provide new affordable housing to replace slums, but soon eliminated the promised new affordable housing from its plans. Contract home buyers in the West End found it effective that they did not have partnership rights to their homes, that were sold out from under them by the predatory lenders to the city and to new property investors. Federal money was used to remove existing residential property and develop new expensive commercial property for white-owned businesses that now moved into the West End and now referred to by the property developers and the city officials as a redevelopment survey area. Renters were pressured out by rising rents and the continuous elimination of residential property. For decades, residents organized against the redevelopment policy.
By the 1970s, the population of the formerly redlined West End was evicted. The displaced residents of the West End moved and resettled to what neighborhoods that were not restricted by racial covenants, most notably Oak Park and county land south of it, but also to remote neighborhoods on the north side of the county. These areas quickly became segregated neighborhoods again, redlined by banks and housing lenders, oppressed with the same treatment and predatory contract lending practices and all the other problems of the old West End. The experience of being displaced from one's home neighborhood in such distressed circumstances and often into even more difficult housing conditions and social circumstances took a bitter toll on the resegregated population. During this time, over 90% of the rental market in Sacramento remained closed off to non-whites, creating a critical shortage of housing for people of color. Now today, looking back 50 years to the long, hot summer of 1967, when 159 uprisings and riots swept across cities throughout the United States, we would do well to remember that, as with the Watts riots, housing discrimination and acute neighborhood overcrowding were again and again cited as a key factor in provoking this violent civil unrest. The federal housing law, enacted as Title VIII of the Civil Rights Act of 1968, finally made it illegal to discriminate in selling and renting housing on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And yet, redlining and contract home sales agreements persisted everywhere. Racial restrictive covenants were no longer legally enforceable, but the informal habits of housing discrimination went on as before. Over the past 5 decades, the Fair Housing Act has seldom been enforced here.
Oak Park, I know. Thank you, brother.
Hi, my name is Brenda Flowers, and I'm one of the homeless in the city. Subprime mortgages impose serious usurious interest arrangements and fees on individuals and families attempting to buy homes in the segregated neighborhoods where historic exclusion has put them. Subprime mortgages, by their nature, inflict high rates of foreclosure and loss of equity. This is in communities from which wealth is extracted, not accumulated. This is again the brutal reality of systemic racism. Now, as the actual space of these neighborhoods is transformed by fast rising rents and gentrification, which is impacted the hardest by your high rent increases. Who is impacted the hardest by the displacement of gentrification? What sorts of neighborhoods will they be able to relocate to? Your market rate housing displaces working people into desperate circumstances, but most onerously on people of color. The paltry number of affordable housing units we might even hope to see will be situated with the most difficult access to employment and social and civic resources. Your housing policy drives conditions of ever greater inequity and privation, conditions which generate conflict and violence. The violence is for the most part the violence of the marginalized against the marginalized, seemingly random, incoherent, and self-injurious. The police are expected to enforce public order, but this is a public order embedded in the system in the systemic racism you perpetuate? How can we expect the relationship between the police and distressed communities they patrol to be anything but toxic and deadly? Today, Sacramento's housing policy is commanded by vast accumulations of wealth and capital in the hands of real estate investment and development interests and property management concerns. One has to wonder how much of that wealth and capital is derived and handed down from the past accumulation and hoarding of predatory lending, redlining, and racial restricted covenants. Public policy with a racist outcome is a racist policy. Thank you for your time and attention.
Actually, I think I want to backtrack just a bit. It's important to understand that the difference in income between black and white households has hardly changed at all in 50 years since the day the Fair Housing Act became law in 1968. In the United States, while income of the average black adult is 60% of the average white adult, the average white American has 5 times the wealth as the average black American. The average white American household is worth 20 times as much as the average black household. For the American middle class and working class, ownership of a home is the key access to wealth. And without it, African Americans were refused the chance to save and build assets to pass on to their next generation. And we might note that this is also the case for many Latino families and many families of color in general. The inequality of wealth means an inequality of opportunity and quality of life that is so severe that it seems now to be a permanent and essential condition of life in Sacramento as it is in America in general. More recently,